Hello and welcome to Useful Idiots Monday Morning, where we react to the Sunday morning news shows that we watch so that you don't have to. I am one of your hosts, Katie Halper, and I'm hiding my headphones.
And I'm the second host, Aaron Maté, and I'm not wearing headphones, so easy ride for me.
Yeah,
good morning,
seriously.
Good Monday morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. Remember to like the stream to help us beat algorithmic suppression.
Yes.
Because the powers that be don't want us laughing at them.
Mm-mm.
Because that's what we do here. We have fun making.
No, keep going.
Go ahead.
I think we chased away the Chuckster. I think it got to be too much for him. Weekly mocking.
That could be the title of our first maybe Useful Idiots memoir, Chasing Away the Chuckster.
Yeah, that is good. Yeah.
Yeah.
I like that.
Yeah.
Chasing away the Chuckster. Yeah.
Well, the Chuckster is not chased away yet, thankfully.
We have a little bit more time with him. And also, I'll be doing a call-in right after the show. I'll have to add the link in. I guess I'll tweet it out, or I'll go back into the Substack. About 2 minutes after the show, you guys will have the link in the YouTube description. Also, make sure that you join us on either Substack or Locals. That's usefulidiots.substack.com, usefulidiots.locals.com, and you get extra content, extended interviews, and you even get this great feature called Thursday Throwdowns, which is where we do this basically, but to clips that we don't get to on Monday morning because they're midweek clips. And it's a great time.
It's a really great time.
It's such a great time, yeah.
Please join us there, usefulidiots.substack.com or usefulidiots.locals.com. Should we get to
the Chuckster
while he's still with us? Because, for those who don't know, Chuck Todd recently announced he's leaving Meet the Press pretty soon, but we have one fun summer left with him.
Yeah.
This is the summer of the Chuckster, so let's hit it.
And a good Sunday morning to all of you out there. With the Iowa caucuses just 6 months away, mark your calendars for January 15th, officially, by the way. The two parties are debating what the coming campaign is going to be about, the intensifying culture wars or a referendum on the economy. President Biden is hoping to claim credit for what is an improving economy. He's ramping up a messaging tour focused on the economic agenda that he is embracing and calling Bidenomics. Inflation has dropped for 11 straight months from a high.
What do you think of that, Katie? Bidenomics.
I mean, he's calling back. It's a callback to the Gipper, to Ronald Reagan. Reaganomics.
Yes. Oh, yes. And what a success that was.
Yeah. For a lot of these people, it was. It's really pathetic.
Yeah. If you're a member of the 1%, absolutely.
Yeah. And the Gipper, of course, Reagan. Yeah.
9.1%.
They should have called it Gippernomics. That would.
Gippernomics. Yeah. I like that a lot more.
Yeah.
In June of last year to 4% this May. Unemployment stands at 3.6%. That is near a 50-year low. And 13 million jobs have been added since Biden took office. We've completely recovered from the pandemic drop. But the American public is not feeling it. Just 34% of Americans approve of Biden's handling of the economy in a recent AP poll that was released at the end of June. And only 20% of voters believe the nation is on the right track.
So who should we believe, Katie? Do you think we should believe members entirely of the 1% who all make, really high salaries, live very well, who are telling us that things are great on paper? Or should we believe the actual people who are subjected to these policies and who, make the economy move? I mean, I don't know. Tough call.
I'm torn.
Right?
Tough call. Yeah. I mean, I kind of feel like we should be trying to persuade them and show them how things are better, how they don't realize it. But that's because they're not trying hard enough.
Enter the Chuckster.
Enter the Chuckster. Yeah.
Though voters have not felt good about the direction of the country for over a decade. And Biden is trying to persuade voters that the economy is better than they think it is.
And guess what? Bidenomics is working.
I'm not here to declare victory on the economy. I'm here to say we have a plan that's turning things around quickly.
It's about growing the economy from the middle out and the bottom up. Today's job shows that jobs report shows that Bidenomics is working.
Now, this is actually a familiar pivot for incumbent Democratic presidents in the last 30 years. Both Bill Clinton and Barack Obama had to make the case that their economic policies were working to a skeptical public as they were vying for a second term. And it's a necessary pivot for the Biden.
It's so funny, like You think if the economy was working, the president presiding over it wouldn't have to make the case constantly that it's working, to convince people,
Right.
no, it really is going well.
Exactly.
Trust me. Yes, you're working 4 jobs.
Right. No, I swear.
Yes, you can't afford health care, but I swear it's really working. I swear. All we have to do is put my name in front of Anomics,
By the way,
and
yeah,
that should convince you.
Right. And there it goes. Yeah. You don't have to believe me. Just believe the fact that this thing called Bionomics exists. If it weren't real, it wouldn't have.
Campaign. But ultimately, it could end up being that the culture war issues like abortion that Democrats end up rallying around, especially as the Republican Party continues to focus even more time on cultural issues.
School bureaucrats do not know better than parents. We've got to go and defeat them from the ground up and let them know that we are not going to have this indoctrination in there.
We are going to end men joining women's teams.
Identifying Donald Trump as really being a pioneer in injecting gender ideology into the mainstream, where he was having men compete against women in his beauty pageants.
And in fact, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who's trailing Donald Trump by 30 points in many national primary matchups, continues to try to run to the right of Trump on these social issues like abortion and LGBTQ rights. In fact, this week, DeSantis' rapid response team reposted a video on Twitter attacking Trump for formally expressing support for the LGBTQ community. The video was criticized even by Republicans and has since been taken down. Now, one Republican candidate who is already outspending all of his rivals right now in advertising in Iowa and New Hampshire is betting that there is a lane for a Republican candidate that is solely focused on the economy and national security rather than on what he calls anti-wokeness. On Friday, I traveled to Fargo, North Dakota, and I sat down with the governor of North Dakota, Doug Burgum. He's a 66-year-old former software exec and a 2-term governor. And yes, he is self-funding much of his presidential campaign right now. In April, Burgum signed a law that did ban abortion at 6 weeks, and he has signed 8 bills into law that has been pushed by his very conservative legislature that limits the rights of transgender North Dakotans. But at the same time, he is arguing that Republicans will do better in 2024 if they focus solely on pocketbook issues.
I like the way this guy, by the way, welcome to the race.
Yes, whatever your name is.
Yeah, Doug.
Yeah.
But I like
welcome.
the way that this guy is like, we shouldn't focus on the culture wars, but I am going to be launching them and fighting them. I'm just not going to run on them solely. Yeah.
I'm signing all these culture war bills. I'm banning abortion after 6 weeks. But yes, I don't think we should run on that.
Yeah, let's not run on it. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Gov Doug Burgum. And by the way, this is interesting. So the Chuckster thinks it's appropriate to have this guy on. Sure, you should have on people who are running. You know who he still hasn't had on?
Every challenger to Joe Biden on the left.
Right, exactly. No RFK Jr., no Marianne Williamson, and no, obviously, Cornel West. I'm
confident. The Chuckster's reign at Meet the Press ends in the fall, right? He's stepping down in September, October.
Yeah.
I'm confident he's going to have all of them on before it's over.
Yeah.
Maybe on his last show, he's going to have just like an hour-long roundtable.
That would be amazing.
Yeah, imagine that.
I'm
just kidding. I'm kidding, everybody, for those who don't catch my sarcasm.
Yeah,
it's
that's not an actual prediction.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, by the way, we covered that Ron DeSantis story. It was our Republican Suck last week. I think that probably Chuck Todd got the story from us.
Or maybe Ron DeSantis was forced to delete that
video
because of us.
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Yeah.
Because of our, just vicious satire, mocking of him. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Okay.
Alrighty. What do we got next?
Well, the big news this week on the Sunday shows is Ukraine, which has been sidelined a lot of late. But this week you have the Biden administration deciding it's a good idea to send cluster munitions to Ukraine after previously criticizing Russia for using cluster munitions in Ukraine and accusing them of war crimes. And you also have the NATO summit in Lithuania, where even though we're fighting a war over Ukraine's supposedly fighting a war over Ukraine's theoretical right to join NATO, Biden is still saying that Ukraine is not ready to join NATO. So
he's negging NATO.
Yeah.
Big
So
time.
here is Biden speaking to Fareed Zakaria of CNN.
And by the way, just pause for 1 second. I guess we can wait to talk about cluster munitions. We'll get into what they are when we get to the cluster munitions clips. This is a NATO clip. So, okay, ignore what I just said.
President, an honor to have you on the program.
Good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
When you go to the NATO summit, the big strategic issue is that Ukraine wants membership in NATO. Should it get membership in NATO?
I don't think it's ready for membership in NATO, but here's the deal. I spent, as you know, a great deal of time trying to hold NATO together because I believe Putin has had an overwhelming objective from the time he launched 185,000 troops into Ukraine, and that was to break NATO. He was confident, in my view, and many of the intelligence community, he was confident he could break NATO. So holding NATO together is really critical. I don't think there is unanimity in NATO about whether or not to bring Ukraine into the NATO family now, at this moment, in the middle of a war. For example, if you did that, then, you know, I mean what I say, we're determined to commit every inch of territory that is NATO territory. It's a commitment that we've all made no matter what. If the war is going on, then we're all in a war. You know, we're in war with Russia if that were the case. So I think we have to lay out a path, for the rational path, for Ukraine to be able to qualify to get into NATO. And we have, when the very first time I met with Putin 2 years ago in Geneva, and he said, I want commitments on no Ukraine in NATO. I said, we're not going to do that because it's an open door policy.
Okay, let's process what Biden just said.
Yeah.
At the start of the clip, he says that Putin's overall objective was to break NATO. Okay, that's what he says was Putin's overall objective in going into Ukraine. Now, that right there, that's a contradiction of the White House line to date, which is that Ukraine's overriding objective in going into Ukraine was to take over Ukraine, to colonize Ukraine,
Right.
to overthrow the government. So Biden's contradicting himself there because now he's saying Putin's overall objective was to break NATO. But then he says, when I met with Putin 2 years ago, and he's talking about their summit 2 years ago in June 2021, he says that Putin asked him for a firm commitment that Ukraine would not join NATO.
Right.
So again, that's another contradiction because what is it? Putin's direct request to him was a commitment that Ukraine not join NATO. Now he's saying Putin's objective was to break NATO, which is different than what he's saying now about what Putin asked, because of course Ukraine's not a member of NATO. So going into Ukraine is not breaking NATO. It's just trying to prevent Ukraine from joining NATO, which is what Putin asked him 2 years ago, which Biden refused to commit to because he says there's an open door policy.
Right.
And that raises a new question. If now you're still saying Ukraine is not ready to join NATO, was it worth risking this war, and I would argue provoking this war, just for the sake of preserving an open door policy?
Right.
Because, you know, Russia made its demands very clear, and not just that Ukraine not join NATO, but also that NATO roll back its military infrastructure surrounding Russia, including these 2 missile sites in Poland and Romania. And the U.S., as we know, refused to discuss any of this.
Right.
So the question is, if you're still not even saying that Ukraine's ready to join NATO, was it worth risking this war if you knew it could be avoided by simply taking NATO membership for Ukraine off of the table?
Well, obviously the answer to them is yes, because
Yes.
they didn't want to. The priority was not preventing war. The priority was damaging Russia, as we know from literal statements from the administration.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why I think this wasn't just negligence on the part of Biden. I think they deliberately provoked this. I think
Right.
they continued this policy of waving around this open door, knowing that refusing to take it off the table would bait Russia. And then you have that in conjunction with other developments, including Ukraine escalating its shelling of the Donbass and refusing to implement the Minsk Accords. All this contributed to the mess we're in right now. And Biden, I think, is newly underscoring that with what he's saying there. And again,
And
it's
what
like,
would make them ready also?
well, Biden goes on to explain that. And it's actually revealing what he says.
We're not going to shut anybody out. NATO is a process that takes some time to meet all the qualifications, and from democratization to a whole range of other issues. So in the meantime, though, I've spoken with Zelensky at length about this. And one of the things I indicated is the United States would be ready to provide, while the process was going on, and it's going to take a while that process was going on, to provide security a la the security we provide for Israel, providing the weaponry, the needs, the capacity to defend themselves if there is an agreement, if there is a ceasefire, if there is a peace agreement. And so I think we can work it out, but I think it's premature to call for a vote, in now, because there's other qualifications that need to be met, including democratization and some of those issues.
So you see what he says there, that Ukraine's not ready,
Right.
in part because it's not fully democratized.
Right.
It has to work on democratizing. And that's another contradiction of the Biden administration line, which is that we're supposedly in Ukraine to defend democracy against autocracy, right?
Yeah.
Ukraine's the model of democracy that Putin is trying to wipe out. So we have to defend it. Now Biden is saying, actually, they're not really up to par democratically. So they have to work on that before we can let them in.
Right.
And so, because they don't want Ukraine in NATO right now, because Ukraine is a very corrupt country with a lot of issues. And also because, as Biden explained, they don't want to actually get in direct war with Russia.
Right,
They just want to sacrifice. They want to sacrifice Ukraine and use Ukraine as bait to weaken Russia.
Fight them over there, so we don't have to fight them over here.
Exactly. Or
as
fight
Adam
them to,
Schiff said.
or fight them to the last person, as in Ukraine, as Lindsey Graham said. So that's the policy, and he's making it very, very plain there. Yep.
And it's just so sad and pathetic, and to see how they're just playing Ukraine.
They are. And to underscore that, here's Zelensky still going on TV and pleading for NATO membership, which is just not going to happen.
It is really stunning. I know we already made this point, but it is just stunning to imagine that all they had to say was, we won't let them into NATO, which we're not going to do anyway.
I know.
It's just so stunning.
And then also, that would have been a really good start, and that would have at least, I think, delayed the war. There would have also have to be serious negotiations over the Minsk Accords, which Ukraine refused to implement, and that was the peace deal that was reached in 2015 to end the war in eastern Ukraine, which began the year prior after a U.S.-backed coup. And Ukraine was basically dragging its feet, refusing to implement it. In fact, Zelensky's top aide, Andrei Yermak, recently said that a major obstacle to peace in Ukraine was Russia's insistence that Ukraine implement the Minsk Accords. What he's saying in real words is that a major obstacle to peace was Russia's insistence that Ukraine implement the peace deal that it signed.
Right.
So Russia was just asking Ukraine to implement the peace deal that it signed, and Ukraine didn't want to do that because it didn't want to give up some limited autonomy to Russian-speaking areas of eastern Ukraine, and didn't want to give them a potential veto over joining NATO, even though the country is very split over NATO. So there would have to have been progress on that as well. But certainly taking Ukraine's membership in NATO off the table would have been a huge step, and I think would have been enough to at least get serious negotiations going and prevent the war. But Biden was interested in that, and now Zelensky is still here. He is talking to Martha Raddatz about how Ukraine's still hoping for NATO membership this week.
President Biden's trip to Europe for the NATO summit, where leaders are expected to debate Ukraine's push to join the alliance. We met up with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky at the presidential offices in the heart of Kyiv, heavily fortified and surrounded by security. We spent more than an hour with the president talking about the war, the country's future, and the spirit of the Ukrainian people. We began by asking about the NATO summit and the counteroffensive. There's a NATO summit next week. Have you made up your mind whether you will go?
Vilnius summit is very important. If there is no unity regarding the technical invitation for Ukraine to join the alliance, it's all a matter of political will, just to find the proper wording and invite Ukraine. It would be an important message to say that NATO is not afraid of Russia. Ukraine should get clear security guarantees while it is not in NATO. And that is a very important point. Only under these conditions our meeting would be meaningful. Otherwise, it's just another politics.
So it sounds unlikely that you will go.
Why?
From what you just said.
I think we'll do a lot of work.
What does that mean? You'll do a lot of work.
We are working with our partners. We are working on security guarantees. We are also working on helping our partners to make some conclusions for this upcoming NATO summit meeting. And we would like to have all the decisions to be made during the summit. In this case, it's obvious that I'll be there and I'll be doing whatever I can in order to, so to speak, expedite that solution, to have an agreement with our partners. I don't want to go to Vilnius for fun if the decision has been made beforehand.
Well, the decision has been made beforehand because Biden's already said Ukraine's not joining NATO. And Biden said in that clip we played, what Ukraine will get is that it will get an Israeli-like security arrangement, which basically means turning Ukraine into a further militarized, armed-to-the-teeth proxy of the U.S. It's an appendage of the national security state of the U.S. That's what Ukraine's getting. So a lot more money for the military-industrial complex because Israel gets billions of dollars in U.S. aid every year that's basically funneled through U.S. weapons manufacturers, and that's what Ukraine will get as well. Just more militarization and perpetual conflict with its neighbor.
He and Zelensky himself wanted Ukraine to become Israel-like. Remember, he said
does.
that?
Yeah, absolutely. So at least he's getting that. But let's recall, this is we're going to go back. This is early on in Russia's invasion. This is a few weeks afterwards, and Zelensky admitted that he knew all along that Ukraine would not get NATO membership, but he played along with the farce. And just look at what he said. This is a clip. This is from more than a year ago.
Only to say directly that we are going to accept you into NATO in a year or 2 or 5. Just say it directly and clearly, or just say no. And the response was very clear. You are not going to be a NATO or EU member, but publicly the doors will remain open.
Can't believe it's pretty off-brand for him to say that publicly. I mean, I wish he said that more to expose the Biden administration, but keep going. Sorry.
He admitted what a farce this is. So he asked, what he's saying there, for people who missed it, is he's saying, I asked before Russia invaded for a clear commitment that Ukraine will join NATO and the EU. And I was told you're not going to join NATO and the EU, but publicly the doors will remain open. Right. So basically, you're not going to join NATO, but publicly we're going to pretend that you might because we want to, because we don't want to basically bow to any Russian demands. Right. And actually, we want to use this to bait Russia. And he played along with this farce. He let himself be used just so the U.S. could risk a war over an open door policy. And now he's seeing the result. And it's unbelievable that there was no at least debate over this. Like, if Ukraine's not going to join NATO anyway, is it wise to then leave this door open publicly if it could risk a catastrophic war? And there was no debate over that at all. It was just everyone had to be on board with that. If you weren't on board with that, then you're some sort of Putin apologist.
Right.
Okay. Here's more from Zelensky.
And of how the counter offensive is going right now.
All of us, we want to do it faster, because every day means new losses of Ukrainians. We are advancing. We are not stuck in one place. We've already overtaken the initiative. Several months ago, in some places in the east, we had to retreat. In some other communities, we would regain lost ground, but it was kind of a stagnation, meaning loss of manpower and equipment. And of course, we would all like to see the counteroffensive accomplished in a shorter period of time. But there is reality. Today, the initiative is on our side.
So this is Zelensky trying to grapple with the fact that this counteroffensive that's been widely hyped is not going well at all, and that's not surprising. It was predicted by the Pentagon, and the Pentagon leaks from a few months ago, it was acknowledged that Ukraine had, at best, only a modest chance of success in its counteroffensive. But publicly, Pentagon leaders were saying something very different. Just as publicly, they said something very different when it comes to Ukraine and NATO, between what they admitted to Zelensky privately, that he wasn't actually going to join. But so that's Zelensky having to grapple with that fact. And the U.S. basically pushed Ukraine into this to show some kind of results that could justify more military support. But the result has been a lot more Ukrainian soldiers being killed because, I mean, they don't have any air dominance. And it's really hard to do a counteroffensive when you don't have air dominance. But they're pushed into this anyway. And that's why things are go so badly that now the U.S. is going to send cluster munitions, which we're going to get to in a second. But that's a sign that things are not going well for Ukraine. But before we get into that, this is a report from CBS News about, and we're just going to watch the first minute of this, but there's a really interesting contrast in this clip here, which shows another reality of Ukraine that we're not really allowed to talk about, and that is the neo-Nazi component of Ukraine's armed forces. So this is a report from CBS News.
This morning, a tribute by President Volodymyr Zelensky and Polish President Andrzej Duda in western Ukraine, marking the World War II massacre of tens of thousands of Poles at the hands of Ukrainian nationalists, now united in memory of the victims. Zelensky marked day 500 of the invasion yesterday in a visit to Turkey to bring back home the commanders of Ukraine's Azov Brigade. Having surrendered to the Russians after the siege of Mariupol, under a deal they were to remain in Turkey until the end of the war. Instead, a hero's welcome ceremony in Lviv and a vow to go right back to the fight. The specter of a major nuclear disaster.
So I hope people caught the contradiction there. So Zelensky, as we see in the start of that clip, he's taking part in a ceremony paying tribute to Polish victims of Ukrainian nationalists in the Second World War who were massacred by the tens of thousands, right? He's paying tribute to them. There's another ceremony, though, as we see in the second part of the clip, where he's welcoming home members of the Azov battalion who were under house arrest in Turkey under a prisoner swap deal with Russia. They were captured during Russia's invasion. So he goes from welcoming released members of the Azov battalion
who are Nazis,
and descendants of the very nationalists who massacred all those Polish people, who he's also paying tribute to. So there's just a contradiction there.
What a well-rounded man he is.
Yeah.
And he's Jewish, which makes it all the more rich.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Back to the issue of NATO.
Yeah. Let's see. What do we got now? Oh, this is a good one. This is Chris Coons, senator from Delaware, talking to Margaret Brennan on Face the Nation. Let's see what he has to say about NATO membership for Ukraine.
You have another applicant, Ukraine, as you know. The president gave an interview in which he said he doesn't think Ukraine is ready to join NATO. Have you talked to him about it? And what specifically is it that he needs to see for them to be allowed in? They've been waiting since 2008.
Well, first, we can't admit Ukraine to NATO right now. There's a war going on that has to be resolved, that has to end with Ukrainian victory. I was just on a bipartisan trip, as I mentioned, with Senator Murray, chair of appropriations, to meet with EU leaders and NATO leaders. It's important to keep in mind that what the Ukrainians are fighting for is full membership in Europe, and they are on track to join the EU. Joining the EU also means improving their transparency, their rule of law, their civil society, which lays the foundation for NATO membership in the future.
All right. It's a work in progress.
What it's also meant is Ukraine embracing neoliberal austerity, because back when all this started, back in 2013, 2014, when you had the Maidan protests in support of joining the EU and, against the corruption of the Ukrainian government, a major stumbling block was that the EU was asking Ukraine to commit to cutting pensions and energy subsidies. And once the Ukrainian president Yanukovych read the fine print of this, because he wanted to join the EU, he was like, no way, because this would mean that my political destruction, because this would be so unpopular. And his refusal to sign that agreement then led to an escalation of the protests by Ukraine's far right, which, backed by the U.S., resulted in him being overthrown. And those demands really haven't changed. The EU still is demanding harsh austerity, and they're also not willing to compensate Ukraine for all the losses in trade that would result from it being cut off from Russia. That's been a major issue for a long time. And of course, now, I mean, Ukraine and Russia aren't trading much anyway. But what gets lost in all this is that part of the reason why Ukraine is not in the EU already is because the demands of the EU have been so harsh and would actually hurt average Ukrainians. That's an overlooked aspect of this. And that's, that Yanukovych's refusal to accept those really harsh terms was a factor in his being overthrown in a US-backed coup back in 2014.
Right. Yeah. And isn't he basically saying that Ukraine is fighting for this? I thought they were fighting for democracy, but now they're fighting for admission to the EU and NATO.
Yeah. And the right to be like billions of dollars in debt forever to EU members. Yes, that's right. Okay. Well, someone who agrees with Coons is Michael McCaul, Republican of Texas, because this policy is firmly bipartisan. So McCaul is speaking to Jake Tapper of CNN.
Subjects on the NATO agenda, whether to fast track Ukraine's push to join NATO. I want you to take a listen to what President Zelensky told my colleague Aaron Burnett this week.
The U.S. decide today whether Ukraine will get invited to NATO. This is today's situation, and it's a fact. The majority of the NATO countries support inviting Ukraine to NATO.
The majority support.
Those who have their doubts look only at President Biden, and he knows that this depends on him. It will be his decision.
Do you think President Biden should support an expedited process for Ukraine to join NATO?
I think it should be incremental, Jake. I think first, they have to win the counteroffensive. Secondly, have a ceasefire, then negotiate a peace settlement. We cannot admit Ukraine into NATO immediately. That would put us at war with Russia under Article 5 of the United Nations. So I think...
Okay, so there's the big important piece of information. This is why they can't admit them to into NATO, because this would mean war with Russia, direct war with Russia, as opposed to proxy war with Russia, which is their preference.
Exactly. And he makes a slip there. He says this would put us in war with Russia under Article 5 of the United Nations. He means of NATO, of the NATO Charter.
Right.
Not
slip,
but basically he conflates the NATO Charter with the UN charters because he sees the NATO Charter as reigning supreme, not the UN Charter, which is like the actual foundational for international law. NATO, in his mind, rules supreme. So that's indistinguishable in his mind from the United Nations.
By the way, guys, we have 1,771 people watching, and we have 628 likes. That is under half. We need to get to 700 right now.
Unless we just have so many hate watchers, Katie, which is kind of a compliment.
I guess we could, yeah.
I'm torn, right? On the one hand, obviously you want likes.
But we appreciate the views.
If you're attracting that much, and if you're attracting that much hate, you're
doing something right.
Yeah,
I welcome their hatred. Yeah,
hate is great. Hate is
great. Yeah.
Yeah.
They hate us because they ain't us. Guys, this is where are we at now? I really would rather not have to do this. This hurts me more than hurts you. All right. Where we're at. I like Logan. My only regret is that I only have one like to give. Yeah.
Oh, thank you, Logan.
That is so nice. Yeah.
That's very kind.
And we got someone else who says that they forgot, which we forgive you for.
I don't know. That's no excuse. Sorry. We have to take a hard line.
I mean, yeah, but we got to call people in, not out. Who the people we can call out are the ones who still haven't learned from their mistakes.
I like this from Eric. Don't hate the chuckster, hate the cluster. That's right.
That is good. Yeah.
Put that on a t-shirt.
Yeah.
That's good.
All right. How are we at with likes, Wilson?
I'm seeing 914.
Okay.
Great. All right. Now that's more like it. All right.
That's
Thank
a
you, guys.
Chuckster would be proud of that one.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. All right. Let's go back to the clip now that you guys have done your duty.
I think what the conversation is going to be about is what security agreements can be put in place with Ukraine as a predicate to perhaps NATO ascension of Ukraine into NATO. But I think it's way too premature to be talking about that. But I do think just the talk about it does provide deterrence against Russia, but we have to be careful in the way we do this. Now, remember back in the Budapest agreement, they gave up.
What is he saying there? Talking about Ukraine's potential NATO membership provides deterrence against Russia?
Yeah.
What is he talking about? We're in
yeah.
a war right now that Russia launched to prevent this very outcome. So how did that deter Russia at all? If anything, it's been used to provoke it. And when push comes to shove, they don't want to actually give Ukraine NATO membership now
exactly,
because
right.
They don't want to fight Russia directly. They just want to use Ukraine to sacrifice its people to fight Russia as long as they can. And that's why he's saying that they have to win the counteroffensive. Now he's saying they have to win the counteroffensive. What is he talking about? They are suffering horrendous losses, and it's going so badly that the U.S. is now being forced to send in cluster munitions because, as Biden said, they're running out of ammunition. Biden
Right.
said that to reporters this week. So it's just they're living in a fantasy world.
Yeah, and it's also he's saying the literal opposite of reality. It's not a deterrent to say that that Ukraine can perhaps join NATO. It's literally that is adding fuel to the fire. That's precisely what you say if you want to make sure that Russia stays in this conflict, because it's not tolerable for Russia, for Ukraine to be in NATO. They've been saying that for literally 20 years. So making the stakes of this conflict, making this the stakes for the conflict just makes this like for Russia, an existential thing. And it guarantees the conflict will just continue indefinitely.
The deterrent would be saying, all right, we recognize that Ukraine historically is very divided over the issue of NATO. We also recognize that we would never accept Canada or Mexico joining a hostile military alliance on our border. So therefore, we're going to take NATO membership for Ukraine off of the table.
Right.
We're going to negotiate with you on all these other grievances you have, including the fact that your country, Russia, is surrounded by NATO military infrastructure, and maybe we can roll some of it back, just some of it, not all of it, and we're going to come up with a solution to implementing the Minsk Accords, which Ukraine, because of Ukraine's far right, has refused to implement for the last 7 years.
Right.
That that would be an actual deterrence, but that's not a deterrence that they're interested in because that would mean rolling back U.S. hegemony, and that's off the table.
Yeah. And it's also circular reasoning in that like Ukraine being in NATO would help protect Ukraine, but put the U.S. at war with Russia, right?
Yep.
So we have to wait until Ukraine wins the war with Russia to protect them with NATO. But if they win without being in NATO, then they don't need NATO's protection.
Yeah. And also the way things are going, they're not winning.
They're not going to win, obviously.
It's a false promise.
Right.
All you're saying is they have to sacrifice more people.
Yeah.
Before we can even talk about it.
Yeah.
But at what point will there be a Ukraine left to save at this point? It's
and that's another weird thing. And we brought this up with Scott Ritter, which is like you have people saying we can't negotiate with Putin now because that would be bad for Ukraine and he's going to take over too much of Ukraine. It's like the more time goes by, the worse it is for Ukraine. Like if there had been a negotiation earlier, Ukraine would have had more territory than it will have now.
Yeah, if they had agreed to implement the deal they signed, the Minsk Accords, they would have kept their territory intact. They just would have granted these, these ethnic Russian areas of the Donbass some limited autonomy, basically agreeing not to ban their language, for example, which the Ukrainian government tried to do and was a major factor in these Ukrainians rising up, is because they were cracking down on Ukraine's ethnic Russian identity. So if they just been willing to recognize that there are people inside of Ukraine who identify with Russia, who speak Russian, and they have rights, this could have been avoided. Now, would Ukraine have kept Crimea? No, because Russia took that in 2014, and Russia's not giving that back. Historically, Crimea was a part of Russia until the 1950s when it was transferred by the Soviet Union. Anyway, but that's another story. And the majority of people in Crimea want to be a part of Russia anyway, according to U.S. government polls. So that's the one area that Ukraine would have lost.
Right.
But otherwise, Ukraine's borders would have kept intact. That would have stayed intact, but because they wouldn't implement the Minsk Accords, that's a major reason why we're in what we're in today.
Right.
Let's go back to McCall because he has more to say.
He's has so much wisdom, yeah.
And we're going to rewind it just a little bit.
Nuclear weapons to Russia, but we have to be careful in the way we do this. Now, remember back in the Budapest Agreement, they gave up all their nuclear weapons to Russia, and then we threw them under the bus with that agreement. If we do another security agreement with NATO, with Ukraine, it has to be one that's solid, that all of NATO is behind as a security agreement. The issue of ascension into NATO is a whole different issue.
Yeah, you referred to the NATO Charter, Article 5, an attack on one is an attack on all. So after the war is over, which presumably is a day that will come at some point, would you then support admitting Ukraine into NATO?
Yes, but it would have to be done again incrementally. I think a security agreement with Ukraine to lay the predicate down the road, they would have to come up to certain standards within NATO qualifications to be admitted. But I think, if anything, Jake, they've demonstrated a will to fight, a will for freedom and democracy against tyranny and oppression. I think they've earned it, but we have to put it on the right path forward, not an immediate ascension into NATO.
So it's amazing. Even after the war is over, he's not even pledging to let them in because he's saying they haven't met certain standards. So we're fighting this war ostensibly over Ukraine's theoretical right to join NATO, which he also says they're not even ready to do. And when he talks about, they're not up to par, that's not just because they're corrupt and because of, because they ban opposition parties, which Michael Call doesn't care. He doesn't care about democracy.
Yeah, he couldn't care less. Yeah.
It's also because they're a drain. They're heavily in debt. They've been decimated, and they can't really afford to spend the money that you're supposed to spend on your military industry when you join NATO, because everyone's supposed to spend at least 2% of GDP, which Ukraine wouldn't even be allowed to do. So all this is just a path toward Ukraine being further decimated and further subjugated to the US. And maybe then, finally, when Ukraine is weak enough or is profitable enough for the US, then they could join NATO. It's just like, even now, after all this, he still can't give them a firm pledge.
Right. It's really pathetic.
All righty. Let's go to the issue of cluster munitions.
Oh my God. Okay. So cluster munitions, by the way, are something that, for people who don't know, they have like parachutes basically in them, and they have bomblets, and they not only are they, what makes them especially dangerous is, first of all, they cover up a lot of land, right? Because they have these parachutes in them, so they expand, but also because they have a rate of failure, which means that you have them still there, basically functioning like landmines after they've landed. All right. Now let's hear what Barbara Lee has to say, which stands out a little bit. I'm kind of surprised they let her come on television, but let's hear what California Congresswoman Barbara Lee had to say about these things, which we are now sending to Ukraine.
The White House National Security Council spokesman John.
Oh, sorry, I went in the wrong. No, isn't clip 9?
This is how the White House is trying to justify giving Ukraine cluster munitions despite the risk that they pose to civilians. Take a listen.
There is also a massive risk of civilian harm if Russian troops and tanks roll over Ukrainian positions and take more Ukrainian territory and subjugate more Ukrainian civilians because Ukraine does not have enough artillery. That is intolerable to us. This is their country they're defending. These are their citizens they're protecting. And they are motivated to use any weapon system they have.
What do you think? Do you buy that argument? What's your response?
Nice being with you, Jake. No, cluster bombs should never be used. That's crossing a line. Once you see what takes place, we know what takes place in terms of cluster bombs being very dangerous to civilians. They don't always immediately explode. Children can step on them. That's a line we should not cross. I think the president's been doing a good job managing this war, this Putin aggressive war against Ukraine, but I think that this should not happen. He had to ask for a waiver under the Foreign Assistance Act just to do it, because we have been preventing the use of cluster bombs since, I believe, 2010.
So when Putin started using cluster bombs, the Biden White House said that would potentially be a war crime. Do you think that, therefore, the U.S. government, the Biden administration, will potentially be engaging in war crimes if this goes forward?
I'm kind of surprised with Jake here,
What
by the
I
way.
think is that we would risk losing our moral leadership, because when you look at the fact that over 120 countries have signed the convention on cluster munitions, saying they should never be used, they should never be used. And in fact,
I never understand when someone makes the argument that if the U.S. does this, the U.S. will lose its moral leadership.
Right.
Like, who in the world sees the U.S. as a moral leader, except for people on CNN and politicians in Congress? Does anybody else say, yes, the U.S. is a moral leader, unless they're bought by the U.S. and paid off to say that, basically? So it's an argument. I mean,
and she definitely knows better, because she was like the only person who voted against Afghanistan.
I mean, that's what makes me sad about Barbara Lee. She showed, unlike pretty much everybody else in Washington, she showed actual political courage.
Right.
It was hugely courageous after 9/11 to be the only member of Congress, the only one, to stand up and vote against the use of, endless military force. That's basically what the War on Terror resolution was. And yet she constantly caters to the talking points of the very people who she bravely opposed.
Yeah.
I think it's too bad.
She also endorsed Kamala Harris, which is insane. But
yeah, and now those same people are trying to stop her from joining from being taking the place of Dianne Feinstein, because they want to bring in Adam Schiff, who is obviously a much more devoted warmonger than Barbara Lee is. She's sort of a reluctant warmonger.
Right.
He's a devoted warmonger, and they want to stop her at all costs.
Right. And she also dodges the question, not surprisingly.
Yeah, but I mean, it's good to see at least someone allowed on CNN making this argument.
Yeah.
It just, she gives, I think, too much ground to her.
And I'm impressed also that Jake Tapper lays out this kind of rhetorical question, which is like, if it's a war crime for Russians to do it, is it a war crime for Americans to do it?
Yeah. Yeah. And also, what gets forgotten in all of this, so there is something called the Cluster Munitions Convention. It's signed by over 120 countries. I think Barbara Lee mentioned that. It's not signed by the U.S., Russia, or Ukraine. And both Russia and Ukraine have been accused of using cluster munitions inside Ukraine. I don't doubt them. What does get overlooked is that the cluster munitions didn't just start being used when Russia invaded. They've been used in Ukraine since 2014.
Yes.
And it's Ukraine that's used them against their own people.
Right.
Back when Ukraine launched this offensive against the people of the Donbass who rose up against the coup government, they've been using cluster munitions since then. Human Rights Watch has documented this. So
yes, there's a report that Human Rights Watch documents from 2014, and they have a report from as recently as July 6th, also documenting the use of cluster bombs by Ukrainian government.
Yeah. And I believe didn't you just tell Michael McCall, because Michael McCall, the former U.S. ambassador to Russia, he was just asking for evidence of this, right? I believe you told him. Has he responded to you yet?
No, he did not. And I gave him the opportunity to respond, because he said, like, I'm no international lawyer, but if Ukraine has used cluster munitions, I would condemn it. And I did tweet to him at 8:24 p.m. Sunday. Ukraine has been using cluster bombs since 2014. See Human Rights Watch link I'm posting below. Here's your chance to denounce that forcefully. Because he says, if Ukraine does that, I will denounce it forcefully. Okay, well, Michael.
You're on notice, Michael.
You're on notice, yeah. All right. Well, you know what? Let's actually skip to clip 11, where we hear from Ambassador Oksana Markaryova, who's being asked about the use of cluster munitions. This is an interesting question, and interesting framing, especially given what we just reviewed about Ukraine using cluster bombs.
Cluster munitions drop bomblets, and sometimes those bomblets don't explode right away. And years later, they can be a danger. I've met victims who've been blinded and maimed in places where the U.S. dropped these decades ago. So when the White House says that Ukraine has made assurances on how it will use these, how do you do this and assure that civilians won't be hurt?
Well, first of all, let's remind where we start with. Ukraine is the most mined country now already. Russians mined everywhere. The unexploded ordnances everywhere. So we're doing a lot of demining. And U.S., by the way, is helping us a lot in demining already now. With regard to these munitions that we will be getting from the U.S., first, they are of a much higher quality, so to start with. And second, as responsible as we are with all other American supplied or European supplied munitions, we are controlling it. We have a very responsible ways. We use the NATO type of log-fast system to record every unit that we have, where it is. We will use the same type of approach to this. We will know where we use it, how we used it. And of course, you know, every time we liberate our territories, these deminers are the first people that go there, try to make sure that the area is safe. So we will do exactly the same.
And I imagine Russia uses these on civilian areas. I have to imagine Ukraine has pledged not to do that and only to use them on soldiers.
Oh my God, they use this and phosphor and everything else specifically on civilian areas and destroying civilian areas.
And that's
we definitely, we will not use it in civilian populated areas.
So the most leading question, she has to imagine they won't use them on civilian areas. Of course. I mean, it's not even a question. She's just being like, can you make sure you put in right now? I'm giving you the chance to put in a line where you're going to pretend. Like, I actually don't know if Margaret Brennan thinks that they don't use them against civilians or knows that they do and is lying. But either way, it's very irresponsible journalism. And what she should say is, you guys use them against civilians in the past. Are you going to stop doing that? But instead, she's just like, oh, you've been using them. You're not going to be using them against civilians, right? I can only assume.
And again, all Margaret Brennan would have to do is just use Google.
Right.
Just type in Ukraine cluster munitions. And one of the first things that could come up, unless Google was like suppressing it, here's this. I'll just show this. This is from 2014.
Yeah.
From Human Rights Watch.
I'll put it in the chat.
Ukraine, widespread use of cluster munitions, government responsible for cluster attacks on Donetsk. And that's 2014. It's a long time ago. And that's so it's been going on for a long time. And maybe Margaret Brennan isn't aware of that, but that's a reality.
Right.
So
one of her interns should have been when they looked at the script.
These assurances mean nothing. And we've seen that not just with this example of cluster munitions, but also, you know, Ukraine pledged not to use U.S. weapons to attack inside of Russia. Well, we saw what happened recently where there was this cross-border raid by neo-Nazis who are actually from Russia, but are now fighting on Ukraine's side.
Right.
They used U.S. equipment to go across the border and attack a Russian area. So there's been all these assurances that have been crossed. Remember when Ukraine air defense launched a missile by accident, or maybe it wasn't an accident, I don't know, but let's believe the official story, it was an accident, into Poland, and immediately said that it was Russia that did that. So can these, and then Biden had to even say, no, it was actually Ukraine, because, you know, that would have triggered World War III. So can we trust Ukrainian assurances when they have a documented history of violating them and even lying?
Right.
when they almost start World War III? Apparently all that recent history is forgotten.
Which is why it's so dangerous to do this totally Manichaean Russia evil, Ukraine angelic, because it really makes a caricature of morality. And it leads people to think that literally everything Russia does is like the devil's work, and everything that Ukraine does is the angel's work, which is why you would expect them to not use cluster bombs against civilians.
Yeah. And, you know, even if everything these people said about Russia was possibly true, you could at least try to find out via diplomacy, at least give it an effort. But there's been no effort at all. Blinken refused to even speak to Lavrov for the first 6 months of the war, because the goal was not to end the war and defend Ukraine. It was to weaken Russia. So everything is being done now in the service of that goal.
Right.
Not of defending Ukraine, but of weakening Russia, which makes, and then when you paint Russia as this, like, you know, irredeemable country that can't be trusted, can't be negotiated with, you're making diplomacy impossible. It's just not going to happen. But the more you do that, the more Ukrainians you sacrifice. So why not try diplomacy, see what comes of it? Maybe it will, maybe nothing will come of it. Maybe Russia won't accept anything. I don't know. It's possible at this point, but why not at least try? Rather than sending in all these more dangerous weapons of war that will kill and maim people. It just doesn't.
Well, it's okay because they're not going to use them on civilians.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Okay. John Kirby, White House spokesperson, he is going to defend this decision.
Let's talk about the cluster munitions. The president made the decision to send cluster munitions. They are banned in so many places around the world, including most of our allies. Why send them to Ukraine?
Simple. This is about keeping Ukraine in the fight. You were just there. You talked to President Zelensky about the counteroffensive, and in some ways, it's not going as fast as he would like. They are using artillery at a very accelerated rate, Martha. Many thousands of rounds per day. This is literally a gunfight. In all along, from the Donbass all the way down towards Zaporizhia and Kherson. And so they're running out of inventory. We are trying to ramp up our production of the kind of artillery shells that they're using most. But that production rate is still not where we want it to be. So we're going to send these additional artillery.
You know, what's interesting about this is if you go back to a few months ago, we got all these headlines in establishment media outlets saying that Russia is running out of ammo.
Right.
And the point of those headlines, which are, fed to these outlets by the Pentagon, the CIA, is to make it look as if Ukraine is winning and Russia is losing. That turns out to be yet another lie, because now John Kirby has to admit that actually it's Ukraine that's running out of ammo, and that's why they're so desperate. They have to send in these internationally banned cluster munitions.
Right.
So that's another example of how we get, a torrent of propaganda used to prolong the war, and only long after the fact do we have to admit tacitly that all that is a lie.
Yeah, and also, why don't we have the right kinds of munitions that they need? Like, we've been in this war and funding and providing arms for this war for a minute by now. And this also shows how unserious we are about actually arming them. Yeah.
And it goes back to a point that Obama made when he was leaving office, and he was interviewed by Jeffrey Goldberg, this neocon editor of The Atlantic. Right. And Goldberg was criticizing him for not basically being willing to fight a war with Russia over eastern Ukraine. And one of the things that Obama said was that, Russia not only has a much more pressing interest in Ukraine than we do, but also Russia has overwhelming military advantage because it's right there on Ukraine's border. They're neighbors, whereas we're halfway across the world. And so we just can't supply Ukraine at the rate that it would need to fight Russia. Obama said that. And when those of us, who criticized the proxy war tried to say that at the start of this war and why there should be diplomacy, not a proxy war, we were, of course, accused of being Putin apologists. But really, it's a point that Obama made. And actually, Antony Blinken made too when he was working for Obama back in 2015. Blinken said the same thing, that Russia just has an overwhelming military dominance. So that's why it wouldn't make sense to try to match them in a gunfight. Now the policy is different. Now we do want to have a gunfight with them, and now we're seeing the result.
Really ridiculous. Really disturbing. Well, we didn't have time to get to this full clip. Maybe we'll do this in Thursday Throwdown because there's a lot to digest here.
Okay, well, should we wrap it there? This has been a great show as always. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Please hit the like button.
Please hit the like button. Subscribe. Also, meet me at Callin. I'll add the link into the description of this YouTube/Rumble in about 2 minutes.
And then again, if you want to subscribe and get bonus content, usefulidiots.substack.com or usefulidiots.locals.com. And thanks everybody for tuning in and for your support.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.